In the most recent live letter, the developers of Final Fantasy XIV announced new abilities as well as job changes that are coming to the game with Dawntrail. So in this video I want to summarize everything that they said in the live letter and also theorize a little bit. Let's start off with the tanks. They announced that all of the tanks will have their 30% personal mitigation improved in the level 90 range, in addition to Rampart getting an upgrade. In a similar vein, Reprisal is getting its duration increased also in the level 90 range to make it last a little bit longer, which either allows you to catch more raid wights with it to decrease the damage overall, or it's just meant to make it easier to use because you can cast it earlier before the damage is coming in. For Paladin, one of the things that they've announced are new atonement animations on the second and third cast. Right now, whenever Paladin uses Royal Authority, they get 3 stacks that they can then spend on atonement. Up until now, the animation of atonement has been the same, which can look quite boring, but now with the animations on the second and third cast, there's a little bit more flavor to it. Outside of that, we're also getting a new combo action after Blade of Valor, so basically a new blade combo action finisher. We'll see what they do with the button bloat that Paladin currently suffers from in comparison to other jobs, but so far neither of the announced changes would be anything new that you have to put onto your hotbars. In the benchmark trailer video, I also theorized about Requiescat being upgraded, because the animation here is very obviously different from the one that's in the game right now. So I still wouldn't be surprised if Requiescat was now an AoE ability. Next up is Warrior, which also comes in with a few simple changes. First of all, there's an entirely new action after executing 3 Fell Cleaves or Decimates inside of Inner Release. As a reminder, whenever you press Inner Release, you get 3 stacks that you can spend on either of these abilities. And now there is basically a combo finisher at the end. Another action that you get access to during your Inner Release window is Primal Rend, which now also has a follow-up, and it's this absolutely ginormous hammer. I think it looks insane. Outside of that, we could also see the upgraded Vengeance here, which is the upgrade that all of the tanks are getting. Personally, I'm really happy with the current state of Warrior, so it's just getting some more abilities to use inside of the buff windows I'm perfectly fine with. Next up we have Dark Knight, which I actually struggled a lot with during the benchmark trailer, figuring out anything that is new. But I actually missed an entire 3 new GCDs in the background, which some people in the comments noted. 2 of the current Dark Knight abilities are Blood Weapon and Delirium. Blood Weapon right now will give you 5 stacks that you can then spend by using weapon skills or spells that will give you blood gauge and also MP on every action. In Dawntrail, at a high enough level, this ability will upgrade into Delirium, which currently lets you execute Quietus or Blood Spiller, which is the Dark Knight spender for your gauge. If we take a close look at the drop action trailer, we can actually see Delirium used here, followed by 3 new attacks, which I think were the ones that we were able to see in the previous trailer. At first glance, I thought that this must be the 3-hit combo, but I actually think these are new abilities that you're able to use whenever you cast Delirium. Each one of these casts seems to give the Dark Knight 10 blood gauge, while seemingly also restoring MP, which is accompanied by a very distinct sound effect. So not only are Delirium and Blood Spiller one ability at high enough levels, but the follow-up abilities also look different, and there are presumably fewer because there's only 3 casts here instead of the 5 stacks you'd have to spend with Blood Spiller before. Outside of that, Dark Knight is also getting a follow-up ability to Living Shadow, which is the 2-minute 50 blood gauge spender ability that they have. Next up is Gunbreaker, and here we're already aware of one new ability because of the benchmark trailer, where it was very obvious that Fated Circle now has a follow-up through Continuation. Just as a reminder, Fated Circle is what you use to spend your cartridges, the resource that Gunbreaker has. It shares a cooldown with the ability Burst Strike, which is a single target ability, but Burst Strike has a follow-up called Hyper Velocity. So now we have confirmation that Fated Circle just has an AoE follow-up through Continuation as well. The more exciting part about this reveal for Gunbreaker was the 3-step follow-up combo for Bloodfest. Bloodfest is the ability that you use to grant yourself 3 cartridges. This is usually used during the 60-second No Mercy window, which is a massive damage buff window that Gunbreaker has, where they have to fit a lot of their GCDs in. So Bloodfest now allows you to use 3 new abilities that appear to be 1.5 second casts. I might be wrong about that, but these seem to be way faster than regular GCDs. Next, we're moving on to the melee DPS, all of which have gotten an upgrade to their second wind potency, that's the personal heal, in the 90s range. So presumably you're going to heal yourself for a higher percentage. Outside of that, Feint's duration is also increased in the level 90 range, just like the tank's reprisal, which again just makes it easier to use and might actually allow you to catch more enemy damage with it. The first melee drop showcase was Monk, and here I saw a lot of very split opinions on the changes so far. The core rotation of Monk has always been about maintaining buffs and dots on your enemies. With these changes, instead of maintaining buffs and dots, Monk now basically just has to use the abilities in a specific order. Because just like every other drop's combo actions, using the right ability will just increase the overall potency of it. This makes it easier to get back into the rotation if you accidentally drop an ability somewhere, but I do think it comes at the cost of something that a lot of players did enjoy about Monk. It does look like these changes are accompanied by an entirely new gauge, and I have to say, this is a little bit crowded now. Like, there's a lot of gauges going on with Monk. So at the top we have the beast chakras. Below that we have what I assume is the basic combo gauge, however that is going to be used. And below that we have the chakra gauge. Monk seems to have gotten a bunch of new animations, and on top of that you can also now accumulate 10 chakra while Brotherhood is active. You can see that instead of overcapping the chakras at 5, one of these will now just turn into a darker color. So this right here I would assume will indicate 6 chakras. And this will just allow monks to accumulate more chakra before overcapping, making it a little bit easier to use. However, at the same time, it appears that they have also increased the potency that you get out of spending your chakras if you have more than 5. So at a lower level, this makes the drop easier to get into, and at a higher level, this improves the amount of mastery you can get. Next up was Dragoon. This is one of the drops that I know the least about personally, but I did my best to figure out what's going on here. One change that they've made is removing the positional requirement from every last single target combo attack, that being the 5th one. That is a mouthful of words to basically say that you no longer have to shuffle from the rear to the flank or from the flank to the rear in the span of 2.5 seconds to land both of the GCDs in a row. Outside of that, at the start of combat, Life of the Dragon will now be available without accumulating any dragon gauge. If this is confusing to you, I don't blame you, but basically this will just allow you to use Star Diver during your opener. This ability is usually not available during your opener because you have to use various other stuff before you even get it, so there is no way to actually use it. This will just allow Dragoon to use one of their strongest abilities during the opener, which is convenient because that's when most of the damage buffs are going to be used and most people tend to pot as well. Outside of this, they also said that they would remove or adjust some abilities to make the burst windows a bit smoother. For example, Spine Shatter Dive. This ability is simply going to be replaced with a dash, which is already how many people like to use the ability, kind of navigating across the battlefield. We also got to see the Nidhogg uppercut again. That was already in the benchmark trailer from a while ago. That looks insanely cool. Next up is Ninja, and here the effect of Huton has been turned into a permanent trait. So the job basically has permanent haste in the background now, past level, I would assume 45. The ability Huton itself still exists, but it's now just an AoE Suiton, which grants the hidden status. As a reminder, the hidden status is required to be able to use your ability Trick Attack. So in AoE situations, you can now cast Huton instead of Suiton to still cast Trick Attack, which can be super convenient, for example, during boss fights if there are multiple enemies. Of course, the abilities that interacted with Huton in its previous iteration had to be adjusted, one of those being, for example, Armor Crush. We can see an entirely new gauge in place of the Huton gauge right here, which at first glance appears to give 5 stacks of some sort that somehow interact with the new rotation. One ability that we already saw is the Hellfrog Large, which I assume is just going to be an upgrade. At this point, I'll be very disappointed if they don't call it Hellfrog Large, by the way. Next up on the agenda was Samurai, and here the changes seem to be pretty straightforward. Now excuse me because I'm gonna butcher a lot of these ability names because I speak zero Japanese, but the ability Meikyu Shisui, that's the one that you use to instant cast your positionals, now lets you use Tsubame Gaishi, which is the ability that so far you used to recast Midare and Tenka Goken. So instead of having to manage the stacks that Tsubame Gaishi has now, you just need to manage your Meikyu Shisui stacks and then follow up with a Tsubame Gaishi every time. Outside of this, Hakaze, Tenkagoken and Midare were upgraded, and the abilities Gorin and Sene now have recast time reduction traits, meaning at higher levels you're going to be able to cast them more often. I wonder how this is going to work, because right now they're on 120-second cooldowns, and you would hope that they would stay aligned with these buff windows. Next up is Reaper, where we're also seeing some very simple changes. First of all, the ability Plentiful Harvest now doesn't increase your Shroud gauge anymore, and instead just grants you the ability to execute and Shroud, which basically means there is no chance of you overcapping your Shroud gauge anymore. I don't know if this is going to have any major implications on the rotations, outside of the fact that you might be able to do a triple Enshroud, which would honestly be pretty wild, but we'll have to see how it plays out. Speaking about Enshroud, there is a new Enshroud finisher, which we already knew about. It looks really cool. And then they were trying to make a point about Hell's Ingress and Hell's Egress, as well as Minor Harpy, but I think they got a little bit lost in translation and they didn't even get the point across. But there's some change involving these abilities. I assume some damage buff or something. Next up were the physical range jobs, and here, just like all of the melee jobs, they got an increase to the potency of Second Wind in the level 90 range. Outside of that, all of the job exclusive mitigation abilities, those being Tactician, Troubadour and Shield Samba, which all have different names, but let's be real, they're the same ability, had their mitigation increase from 10 to 15%. The first physical range that was talked about is Bard, and it does look like they are getting several very interesting changes, one of which is removing the damage from the 45-second buffs. So far these would deal single target damage to whoever the Bard is targeting, and I'm not sure what the gameplay implication of removing that is, outside of the fact that you don't need to target anyone to be able to cast it. Inside of the 45-second buff Wondrous Minuet, Bard is able to collect these stacks on their gauge to be able to cast an ability called Pitch Perfect, and depending on how many stacks they've collected, they're going to deal more damage. Pitch Perfect itself has now been changed to also deal AoE damage, where previously it was exclusively single target. This can lead to awkward situations if you don't plan ahead, because assume you are inside of your Wondrous Minuet buff phase, and then you realize that there's a lot of mobs running around, and now you're stuck casting single target Pitch Perfect. Another change that I wouldn't really call quality of life, but more streamlining things for Square Enix themselves, is combining Straight Shot Ready and Shadow Bite Ready into one ability. Both of these are the random procs that you get, one of which is single target and the other one is AoE. By making them the same proc, you can now decide whether you want to switch from AoE to single target or vice versa, obviously. Outside of being able to do that, it doesn't really change a whole lot. I do think we can see at least two new abilities used here as well, one of which was also in the benchmark trailer. The other one I'm not 100% sure about. I think I'll need some Bard experts to chime in on this one. And at the end of the Bard showcase, we also see this orbital laser looking ability. It's almost like Bard is becoming a magical range DPS. But this certainly has the look of some sort of stronger combo finisher. I think they're trying to make the whole rotation feel a little bit more satisfying, which I really appreciate. Obviously, it's still not as satisfying as bashing your opponent's head in with a giant effing hammer. Whoever came up with this is a genius. But I think it's getting there, and maybe they'll convert me to a Bard player after all. Next up, we got some information on Machinist. For this job, the ability Barrel Stabilizer won't increase your heat gauge anymore, and instead just grants you an execution of Hypercharge for free. Just like how with Reaper, the Plentiful Harvest doesn't increase your gauge anymore. Again, this just avoids you overcapping on this resource, which will simplify it a little bit. Another ease of use addition is charges for Drill. So now instead of having to cast Drill exactly on cooldown every time, because it is a pretty high potency ability on a 20-second cooldown, with at least 2 charges, you'll have more freedom in when you actually want to cast Drill. However, it looks like they didn't add the same thing to Air Anchor or Chainsaw. So as far as I know right now, these are still used without charges. The abilities Heat Blast, Gauss Round and Ricochet will upgrade at higher levels, which is I think what we can see right here. And then there are a few abilities that they didn't mention specifically visible in the job trailer. First of all, we see the follow-up to the Chainsaw ability. And then at the end, we see some kind of finisher with, you guessed it, more guns. So overall, in my opinion, these are some pretty respectable Machinist changes. The last physical range is obviously Dancer, and here we're getting a follow-up to Flourish. That's the ability you can press on a 60-second cooldown that allows you to use various other stuff in your kit. There do seem to be some changes to the dances as well. For example, there is now an action that grants the effects of standard step without actually having to use the ability. How exactly that will be used, I don't quite know yet, but my guess right now is that standard step is going to be banished in between the burst phases. There's also a new action after technical step that uses the Esprit gauge, and that appears to be this one right here. Overall, this looks pretty neat in my opinion, and I don't think most people were really expecting a whole lot of changes for Dancer. Next up are the magical range jobs. And here, very interestingly, Swiftcast recast time was reduced from 60 seconds to 40 seconds in the level 90 range. This is going to allow casters to have a little bit more mobility in that level range. It's also going to allow Summoner to have more instant cast reses throughout a fight. So I think this is a change that primarily benefits Summoners as well as Black Mages who struggle with mobility. Outside of that, in line with the other mitigation changes, Adult's duration has been increased to 15 seconds in the level 90 range. Now, we're starting off with the caster that was probably the least well received, and we'll have to see how this all plays out, but I saw a lot of Black Mages really hate this drop action reveal today. There is one very controversial change. Basically, MP is restored on landing ice spells while Umbral Ice is active instead of passively over time. So if you've never played Black Mage or it's been a while, basically Black Mage cycles between two phases, Astral Fire and Umbral Ice. Astral Fire is when Black Mage uses fire spells to basically deplete all of their MP, and Umbral Ice is when they use all of their ice spells to regenerate the MP that they can then spend again. Up until now, the MP that Black Mages generated during Umbral Ice didn't come from the abilities, but it was gained passively while in Umbral Ice. This allowed for a playstyle called non-standard Black Mage, which, to put it simply, cheated the system a little bit to avoid casting lower average potency spells during the Umbral Ice phase. So this change removes this kind of skill expression optimization aspect of the job, and I think this is why so many people are mad about this change. Outside of this, Black Mage also got an action that allows them to reposition their ley lines. So if you ever accidentally got them stuck in an AoE marker, you can now pull them to yourself. There do appear to be a few new spell animations, for example for this Thunder spell right here. And there is a new ability that appears to use this new gauge right here, which appears to gain stacks as the Black Mage casts more fire abilities, only to be consumed by a new ability. So I'm guessing either it becomes available whenever the Black Mage reaches that amount of stacks, or it deals more damage depending on how many stacks the Black Mage has collected during the Astral Fire phase. But how it actually ends up playing, we'll have to see. Next up was Summoner, and here I think people were also a little bit disappointed because there weren't a whole lot of changes at first glance. Basically, they're adding a new summon that appears to be a demi-summon called Solar Bahamut. So in a rotation, they gave the example that this would be used in the order of Solar Bahamut, into Solar Bahamut, into Phoenix. At the same time, it's going to be interesting how they can maintain the 2-minute rotation, if that's still what they're going for, but none of the other changes have given me the impression that that's something they're going to move away from. But so far, going through your Bahamut and Phoenix, as well as the Titan, Ifrit and Garuda between each one of them, already fills out that 2-minute window. So I'm interested to see how the Solar Bahamut is actually going to be woven in between all of these different abilities. But so far from the drop action trailer, it does just look like Titan, Ifrit and Garuda simply had their windows reduced by a little bit, so presumably fewer casts overall. And then the Solar Bahamut window itself just seems to be 15 seconds long as well. In addition to the changes with Solar Bahamut, there is now a new ability that's available after you cast Searing Light. And at the end of the Solar Bahamut, there also seems to be a cast whenever he's already gone. The next job they showcased was Red Mage, where the ability Manification, which is the one that grants you mana, has now been changed to instead just allow you the execution of enchanted melee combos. So just like the other jobs that had abilities change which allow you to theoretically overcap your gauge, Red Mage also changes their Manification to be a little bit easier to use in that regard. Another change we're seeing is that the AoE combo will now consume 50 mana instead of 60, and then there's a new action after you use Embolden, which is interesting because that's exactly what Summoner got as well with their Searing Light. There does appear to be a new finisher, obviously, as well as several other new abilities, but overall I think Red Mage is looking fancy as ever. I think it's still one of the best designed jobs in the game right now. Moving on to the healers now, the only change that all of the healers got was the Swift Cast being reduced to 40 seconds from 60 seconds in the level 90 range, just like the casters. So again, this is going to allow for more mobility, more instant cast heals whenever you need them, and more importantly, more frequent reses. The thing that had the White Mage players most excited was probably the dash that they've added, which appears to just be a dash in a straight line. And then there's also a new AoE attack that can be executed 3 times after you use Presence of Mind. Presence of Mind is the 120-second haste ability that White Mage has, which most White Mages tend to use during the buff windows to simply deal more damage. So I think adding a damage ability to this is a pretty natural addition to the job. And I think having 3 of these is going to add quite a bit of weaving, which is probably a good idea for White Mage as a job that has relatively few off GCDs. Outside of that, there's going to be a trait, presumably in the level 90 range, that adds another stack to Tetragrammaton, which should overall just improve your healing output and allow you to have more burst healing on demand by having more stacks available. Next up is Scholar, and this is also one of my less played ones, which I actually really want to catch up on in Dawntrail. What I do understand is that we're getting a new AoE attack after Chain Stratagem, which looks very different in general, which will then deal damage over time to the opponents. I do think I'm seeing some new animations or completely new abilities here, but even after checking in game, I'm not 100% sure because the Scholar abilities are pretty subtle. But one thing that's definitely not subtle is the Seraphism ability, which changes the caster's appearance and enhances the healing abilities, similar to White Mage's Temperance, I suppose. Although I think many White Mages would probably prefer this appearance to the wings that they have right now. I mean, this is really giving White Mages a run for their money. Outside of that, there's also going to be a trait that reduces the recast time for Recitation, which is the one that allows you to use a lot of your heals that would usually require some of your resources, while also guaranteeing critical hits. So if you've ever had an absolutely ridiculous Scholar Shield on yourself, it was probably from this ability. I just feel like this iteration isn't super flashy, and I don't think Scholar ever has been, but it's very kind of elegant. I really dig the Scholar aesthetic in this one. The next job that they discussed was Astrologian, which was one that many people assumed was getting a massive rework, but it seems like they're just changing a few things, although those are pretty impactful. So first of all, it seems like the card system has been overhauled in general. It's no longer random, and you're no longer drawing single cards, but you're drawing 4 cards, and as I understand it, you're doing that every 60 seconds. These cards will have different properties: offensive, defensive, and curative. And then depending on the situation that you find yourself in, you'll be able to play these cards on your fellow players. So I assume if you realize that the tank is about to take a tank buster, you can play a defensive card on them, or you can buff someone's damage for a certain period of time during a buff window. How this is actually going to play out, we'll have to see, but I definitely think that this is going to decrease the amount of weaving that you have to do on Astrologian a little bit. At the same time, having cards that aren't just damage buffs, outside of that one Lady of Crowns card that you already had access to, is going to make things a little bit more interesting when it comes to playing the cards. As a consequence of the solo cards being removed, they obviously had to get rid of Astro Signs, and because of that, the ability Astrodyne in general. And according to what they said in the live letter, you're also getting another trait that will give you an extra stack for Essential Dignity, putting these at 3 stacks now in the level 90 range. So more instant cast burst heals, just like what White Mage got. And then the showcase in the trailer ended up with an ability that looks absolutely amazing. With this like solar system, you can see the planets floating around up there. This looks insanely good, whatever this ability is going to end up being at the end. And then the last healer and also the last job before we move on to the new jobs Viper and Pictomancer, which were also showcased, was Sage. In here the changes are pretty straightforward, with the job obviously only having been released in the last expansion. This is going to sound really complicated, but it's actually really simple. Eucrasia enhances Discrasia 2 into Eucrasian Discrasia. Alright, say that 10 times fast. But on Sage, you know how you have doses as your single target ability. You can then cast Eucrasia to turn it into Eucrasian doses, and then it turns into a dot. Eucrasia now does the same thing to Discrasia, so it will turn into an AoE ability that applies a dot to multiple opponents. Sage also now has an action that heals nearby party members when they cast spells, which is kind of like an AoE Cardia. But this is an effect that you use temporarily to basically heal everyone with your abilities. So it's kind of an efficient heal that you can apply over a longer period of time, I assume. Outside of that, there is also a trait that will reduce the cooldown of Soteria, which is the ability that you buff the effect of Cardia. And I would hope that this also interacts with this new AoE Cardia, because that would mean massive heals for everyone if you use both of these abilities together. Lastly, I also want to go over Viper and Pictomancer and what they revealed about both of these jobs so far, as I understand it. I will say that I got a much better understanding of Pictomancer rather than Viper, because Viper's hotbar is sort of all over the place. Because the job is fundamentally designed with very few actions actually on the hotbar, but rather the actions turning into other actions upon usage. So the whole idea of Viper is shifting between your dual blade and your double blade. Now don't get these confused, right? The dual blade is one blade in each hand, and the double blade is whenever both of the blades are stuck together. Each one of these, let's call them stances, has different weapon skills attached to them. And you can also see the skills changing whenever they switch between the weapons. Overall, to me, the job feels like a melee dancer of sorts. Because with Dancer, you also have a lot of abilities that light up as you go through your rotation that you then have to pick between in kind of a priority system. A lot of people tend to say that Dancer is easy for that reason, because you just press the glowy button. But if you actually play Dancer in that way and you actually just press glowy button, you are probably just a horrible Dancer player. The problem with the advice of just pressing the glowy button here is that they're all freaking glowing. So it very much seems like the job is about deciding between branching actions based on the buffs and debuffs that you have on yourself and on your opponent. Outside of that, the job does seem to have some ranged attacks, which are apparently useful for stalling your other abilities if you want to delay them for burst windows or whatever. Again, I'm not sure if she was really spot on with the translation here, but that's what it sounded like to me. As well as obviously allowing you to move away from the boss to deal with various mechanics. But again, if I had to describe it, it would be a fast-paced melee dancer. Pictomancer, I think I understand quite a bit better. On your job gauge, you have these 3 slots with space for different motifs. From left to right, you can draw creatures, weapons, and landscapes. Outside of combat, drawing these motifs, or imagining them, as they say, is an instant cast, but as soon as you're in combat, these require cast times, meaning you'll have to stand still. Once you've imagined the motif and basically put it into your job gauge, you can then render it, meaning you can draw it. Each one of these motifs has a corresponding actions with 40-second, 60-second, and 120-second cooldowns. Meaning inside of every 2-minute window, you're going to summon 3 creatures, 2 weapons, and 1 landscape. Drawing these motifs then gives the Pictomancer access to more abilities on their hotbar. So for example, drawing this hammer allows him to bonk the enemies with this ability down here 3 times. So in that way, it reminds me a little bit of Summoners Titan, Ifrit, and Garuda, which upon usage also allow you access to other abilities that you didn't have before. Your landscape motif, the 120-second one, apparently gives you access to a damage buff to your party that also seems to be a heal. But I do think people have to stand inside of this circle on the ground. Outside of that, Pictomancer has other abilities too. For example, the Ether Hue combo. Here it seems you're comboing from red to green to blue on this ability, and this grants you a white stack in your gauge, as well as 25 rainbow gauge. When you have 50 rainbow gauge, or 1 buff that you get from your 120-second landscape motif, you can then flip the palette to the dark palette. And you can see the same ability that previously went from red to green to blue now goes from cyan to yellow to magenta. The white stacks you can use on instant casts, presumably for movement, and the black stacks apparently let you use more powerful instant casts. So in summary, during burst phases, you probably want to be using your dark palette. And to be able to use your dark palette, you need to store up enough rainbow gauge. The other stacks that you have, unless there is some other usage that we don't know about yet, would probably be used by spending them inside the damage window where possible, and outside of that, just using them whenever you need to be able to move around the arena or whenever you're close to overcapping. And that's pretty much everything they showcased so far that I got out of the presentation. Again, for both of these jobs as well as all of the previous jobs, it's very possible that there are abilities that they haven't showcased, abilities that I missed in the presentation, or abilities that they're just straight up going to rework before the game comes out, even though that becomes less and less likely as time goes on. So please don't take anything in this video for granted right now. If you want more accurate information, we should be getting more of that in about 2 weeks whenever the embargo for the media tour lifts and the creators who were invited can actually talk freely about everything that they've learned. This might actually be one of my longest videos yet, and I did ramble during some parts, so apologies for that. I tried to keep it down. If you did enjoy the video, I'd really appreciate if you could leave it a like, especially if you watched it all the way until this point. And if you want to support the channel even more, I've recently enabled memberships that support the channel directly for those of you who want to go above and beyond. For now, thanks for watching, and I hope I see you guys in the next one. Peace.